although his argument for minority rights is not confined to indigenous peoples, Kinloch makes them his focus because they are so clearly, such a clearly defined case. So-called reservations in North America, as you undoubtedly know, are special jurisdictions over which indigenous Americans have certain guaranteed powers, and within which non-indigenous Americans have restricted property and voting rights. So basically you cannot come onto the reservation and interact politically with the government there. That is to say, I suppose that you could go ahead and you could approach them and try to persuade them to take a particular point of view. But the reality is you wouldn't have a vote unless you happen to be a member of the tribe that lives on that particular reservation. And in any event, so it is also a matter of note, at least in the United States. I really don't know precisely what the structure of the relationship is between the Canadian government, and Laura, maybe you would like to speak to this and when I'm done, and registered tribes. But in the United States, a tribe's relationship is not, in fact, with the state, but is directly with the federal government and is, in fact, addressed by the Constitution by that means. So there is a special relationship, according to the Constitution and the cases that have interpreted it, between indigenous peoples and the federal government. And basically what happens is that states and indigenous peoples compete with each other to some greater or lesser degree in terms of what applicable laws are, in terms of what usages, resources may be put to, and so forth. But the state does not have power at all over the reservation and the resources on that reservation, although in some instances the federal government did preserve rights under the ground of the reservation. The state does not prescribe law for the reservation and the people on that reservation. Only the federal government can do that. Now, Laura, what is the deal, if you know, with regard to the relationship between indigenous peoples and the federal and provincial governments?
In Canada?
Yes. Yes.
If they're not, they're touching me.
Oh, is that me? Okay.
Whoa! Okay, Laura? Are you there? Nadia's here. Nadia looks like she's here.
Okay, just confirm, ask.
I don't know how.
Just ask her. If she's here, she's...
Nadia, are you here?
Can you hear me now?
That's Nadia?
Damn it.
Sounds like we're having special movie effects here. Okay. So anyway, Laura, are you back?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, Laura, so do you happen to know what the legal relationship is between the federal government, the provincial governments, and indigenous peoples? Laura, you're on mute. Laura, you're muted. I can't hear you.
Okay, so the Indian Act was the original document in the Canadian Constitution that kind of defined who could be treated to the Indigenous rights in Canada. They're considered the three founding groups of Canadian culture, so they do have minority rights that are enshrined in the Constitution. As far as how it's related to the provincial governments compared to the federal governments, I don't know totally how that works legally, but there's a big movement right now for the federal government, at least, to right the wrongs of the previous generations. And you can hear me, right?
I can hear you, yes.
Okay, good.
My husband's trying to connect something. Hang on.
UN Covenant on Indigenous Rights.
Right.
For many years. So that's been a big shift in the relationship between the government and the Indigenous people in Canada.
Because for a period it seemed like Canada was kind of backsliding on this. I mean, initially they seemed to be very committed to embracing international law on Indigenous people's rights, and then there seemed to be a period where they were backsliding. So has that been reversed again?
Yes. Well, that was largely during the conservative government of Stephen Harper. It didn't really want to prioritize and recognize the remaining problems in the Indigenous cultures in Canada. But
Right.
with the Liberal government, one of the big parts of their platform campaigning was that they were going to repair the relationships and investigate the missing women of Indigenous people in Canada. And so they've been trying to make good on those promises, I think. And
So-
that's been a big
So your sense of it is that Canadians in general take this issue seriously?
I think more so now that it's been more popularized in the federal politics than previously.
Okay.
I think it's
Because
something that people are aware of, for sure. In Canadian public school system and everything, we get taught a lot about the violations of the rights of Indigenous people in Canadian history. So.
I do not know, having not been in public school for a very, very long time, how, what kind of treatment Indigenous peoples have in our school systems. But what I can tell you is that when I was coming up through school, and obviously this was a very long time ago as I'm approaching 60 now, but at that time basically, we were the good guys and Indigenous people were evil, and we were just trying to settle the land, and they were killing us, and they were therefore evil people. And so anything we did to them was entirely justified. Disturbing though I think that may be today, that was certainly the position that was taken then. And you could see it clearly in the movies that Hollywood generated at the time, where, the whole cowboys and Indians thing was obviously, the cowboys were the good guys, the federal troops were the good guys, and the Indians were the bad people, right? And they were really almost exclusively, at least until the 60s, I would say, represented as being evil people who were doing evil things to us good people. Never mind the fact that, of course, we were stealing their land. I mean, that wasn't even a consideration in this whole picture. Anyway, so is it working yet? No.
It's working, but it's not charging.
Laura, I have a question.
Okay.
Has there ever been any current violent movements from Indigenous peoples in response to government neglect and generational trauma?
I missed the words you said. Any current what?
Violent movements?
Violent movements? There have been protests and strikes, I think, but I can't think of many actual violent protests.
I see. Okay. That's interesting.
You probably were aware that not long ago there was I think it was just last summer, wasn't it? That there was a prolonged attempt to block the extension of an oil pipeline through Indigenous American lands. Do you recall that?
That kind of problem occurs in Canada as well, because there's also lands and traditional areas that and the Canadian oil industry is very important to people, especially where I'm from, so it's a big conflict of interests.
Right. So that continues to exist in both countries then. In any event, so there are innumerable instances around the world, not all of which involve Indigenous peoples, where minority communities have distinct legal and political statuses. They are incorporated into the state, not liberally, but consociationally. Are you guys familiar with that term, consociation? Oli. It is in your book. I think there is some place on this screen that I can write things down. Do you know where it is? I can send them messages.
Not everybody's in here.
Ow.
It's in the top right of the screen. There's a little messenger thing that says show chat.
Here it is. No, that one. I'm back. There it is. Okay.
I don't know how to get the video.
Thank you, Lillian. Okay. Oops. Okay. So basically what that is that you are having smaller units that have some kind of independent existence and that are able to preserve their culture, language, and religion intact, but also obviously have relations with the government or governments, as the case may be in a federal government, of the larger state where they exist. Now these arrangements go not merely to the political legitimacy of states, but also to their viability of states, at least in Kymlicka's view. He is surprised that so many liberal theorists adequately address the role of minority rights in liberal theory, but of course he shouldn't be, because it is actually clearly the product of World War II and what happened immediately after the war. I think, as I have said before, during the League era, the interwar period, that is the period before World War I and World War II, minority rights had been largely embraced more as a political doctrine rather than as a legal one. But basically the idea was that, when we sort of divided or rewrote, if you will, the map of Europe, that what we did is that in order to meet certain needs like strategic defensibility, sufficient resources to establish a state, an adequate population, and so on and so forth. So when we drew borders, what happened is it was unavoidable, if we met all of these criteria for what a viable state was, that we would not include at least pieces of groups of people that would have been on the opposite side of the border, associated with the ethnic group that they were related to. So what was the answer? It was, as I said, a political one rather more than a legal one. It was not human rights as we know it now, but basically the idea was that we were going to afford them a certain group of rights that would in fact enable them to preserve their culture, on the theory that if we did that, that those minorities would in fact be loyal to the government of the state that they were located in. Now the problem was that for a variety of reasons it didn't really work. There was a lot of pressure to assimilate. I'm sure some of that pressure was violent. And there was also a great deal of pressure to expel these individuals. This was even more the case after World War II, where in fact expelling groups of people, that is what we now call ethnic cleansing, was actually deemed to be legitimate in order to sort of, particularly as regarded German minorities. The big issue, of course, and the reason why we just tossed the whole concept of minority rights after World War II was because German minorities in particular became the fifth columns or the extensions of the Nazi government, and they worked to undermine the state in which they were located. And so there was the sense that minorities could not be deemed to be loyal, and so we moved from this sort of group rights formula to, which as I said was largely a political formula, to individual rights on the liberal theory, on the basis of liberal theory. So post-World War II then, the likelihood that anybody would seriously embrace minority rights was not great, and it took quite some time. I mean, for instance, and we're going to go through this, the impact of Brown v. Board on indigenous peoples, the overwhelming position was that everybody had a duty to assimilate and become part of the sort of liberal establishment. So, resistance then to minority rights arises from the liberal view that liberal democracies are characterized by individualism, as I've already said, but also, of course, egalitarianism. Individuals alone have moral status. Each individual is to be respected as an equal by the government. Therefore, liberals demand that each individual have equal rights and entitlements. which means nothing more and of course nothing less. Now, there seems to be therefore no room for minority rights in that model. Once the government treats individuals as equal, there is no reason to treat communities as equal. Individuals and collective rights can't compete for the same space because the value of collective rights derives only from its contribution to individual lives. And I think we mentioned that before. Now, as I've said repeatedly, Brown v. Board, for some reason I have that this it was issued, that opinion was issued in 58, but it was actually 54. Anyway, had an enormous impact on the development of jurisprudence around the world, not least, of course, because the United States was a dominant power. Following World War II, it had achieved great power status almost certainly after World War I, but then it has sort of ascended to what we came to know as superpower status after World War II, largely because of its possession of nuclear weapons. In any event, so it and its progeny did away with the unequal status of individuals because of the dominance of American constitutionalism. The conception of equality which grew out of Brown underlies the most prominent philosophical counts of liberal equality. Now, we're going to talk about colorblindness, but as we understand it from a purely legal and not political perspective. So we then developed a colorblind constitution. And basically what that meant is that this approach removed old legislation differentiating peoples in terms of race and ethnicity, with the exception of temporary measures like affirmative action, which was believed to prepare the way to becoming a truly colorblind society. Remember now, affirmative action, the purpose of it, the essential purpose of affirmative action is to integrate and assimilate, whereas minority rights has trends towards the opposite direction. Now, the conclusion was that liberal equality requires a universal mode of incorporating citizens into the state. Kimlicka turns to the example of Canada, which did not have the problem of a black minority, but rather attempted to apply the concepts of Brown to the Canadian Indigenous peoples, or to Canadian Indigenous peoples rather, and attempted to dismantle the system relating to their special status within Canada. While the new view accepted short-term affirmative action to ensure equality, it did not accept the extension of permanent political rights to a special class of citizens. Such special rights, it was thought, did not result in the equality that only could be afforded by assimilation. Indigenous peoples, of course, were opposed to proposals to eliminate their special status that had been proposed by well-meaning Canadian leaders after Brown, and so they were withdrawn. Opponents, however, believed that this was in fact the first step towards apartheid. Now remember, this was a question that we raised last week, and that is, what is the distinction between minority rights and Plessy v. Ferguson? Does anybody want to expand upon that at this point? Who was right in the Canadian debate, and why? Laura, I know you must surely have opinions on this.
In the debate on the affirmative action.
Well, no, on the question whether Brown should apply or whether Indigenous people should continue to have a special status and minority rights.
Well,
I mean, the point that Kimlicka makes is he believes sincerely that the people who were advocating the application of Brown were well-intended, but the sort of underlying message being, of course, that yes, but however well-intended they were, in fact, it was destructive. And do you agree with that, or do you think he's wrong?
I think there can be an argument made that it wouldn't be helpful, because if you look at it from the perspective of the minority group in Canada, of the Indigenous people, I think that having their own legal status is something that is something that they don't want to lose. And so while Brown does attempt to equalize different groups, that might not be what is the most pragmatic to actually helping with the challenges facing the Indigenous people in Canada. So I can see that argument.
But the question is, are we talking about pragmatism, or are we talking about equity? What is equitable in terms of how we address the indigenous rights? I mean,
Well, there's definitely an argument to be made both ways because
I would suggest that Brown would be pragmatic. You know, that we just get rid of the whole problem by assimilating the entire group and by treating them as equal citizens of Canada or equal citizens of the United States. That would be pragmatic. Don't you think?
if pragmatism just means getting rid of distinctions, then yes. But if you look at it as a perspective of Indigenous people in Canada are often at just a much lower starting point than non-Indigenous people in Canada, and if the goal is to equalize opportunity rather than to equalize status, then maybe you could argue that having status and having institutions in place to help, or affirmative action to help Indigenous people be at the same starting point as non-Indigenous people, then that is also a pragmatic approach.
Okay. Okay. Anybody else want to add anything at this point? Does anybody, I mean, the reality is, and you'll excuse my language, but the reality is that Indigenous peoples the world over got screwed badly by colonial powers, and that has been going on for hundreds of years, particularly obviously on this side of the ocean, but also certainly in Africa as well. So that being true, it seems to me that we certainly have an obligation, an ethical obligation to address what we did. And Laura, you read, I know closely, the article about what was happening on the reservation in Canada, right? You want to describe some of the implications of what we have done to them?
Well, as a result of the residential school system put in place by the Canadian government in order to assimilate and to completely end Indigenous culture in Canada and assimilate them into Canadian culture, residential schools were put into place where people were abused and removed from their families and their parents and their heritage and forced to speak in European languages and lose their own heritage and culture. And while most of those schools were phased out, some of them weren't phased out until the 90s. And so generationally, that caused just enormous social and economic problems in the cultures themselves, where people have lost the ability to parent their kids, and the cycle goes on and on. Alcoholism is passed generationally as a means of coping. And then, as a result, these areas, these reservations in Alberta, in particular what the article was about, just have huge mental health problems as a result of all of this generational abuse. And
there was a theory that she used about trauma, intergenerational trauma. Was that it? Is that what she talked about?
In the article?
Yeah.
I don't remember if they used that actual term, but
maybe that is just something we discussed when we were talking about it. But go on. Anyway, so the point is,
the article was about all of the suicides that were taking place as a result, because there was an above average number of suicides taking place in those populations compared to the Canadian population as a whole.
Right. So it was catastrophic, basically. But the question would be, had both either or both the United States and Canada stuck with a single policy, would it have been okay with you if, in fact, we had stuck with the assimilationist policy? It had been catastrophic for a generation, perhaps two, and then it settled down and everybody was okay because they were fully assimilated. Would that have been a satisfactory solution?
Well, I think the forcible assimilation was ethically wrong in the first place, so it's hard to make an argument for that, especially in the manner that it was carried out. Just because the conclusion is less problematic than the actual conclusion turned out to be, I don't think that's a way of justifying. But
one argument that has been made is that we kept on veering back and forth between these two policies of preserving them as a separate group and of assimilating them. And if we had stuck with assimilation from the get-go and really, pushed forward with that agenda, that they would have been fully assimilated and the question would have ended and they would have been equal citizens on equal footing with everyone else. Do you find that persuasive? Because the reality is that most states worldwide... Who is Paris? Paris, are you there? I'm not talking about Paris, the celebrity. I'm talking about Our Lady from Paris, whose name is Emile.
Oh.
Oh, you can't speak. Okay. I was just going to ask, you type yes, but in the library, so I can't speak out loud. Okay, but you can write something for me. Are there groups of people in France that, in fact, are not French? And who are they? They actually have separate languages, do they not? She's typing. The obvious answer would be the Basque and the Corsicans. Are those the only folks? I thought there was... I'm sorry, I'm losing somebody's name here again. Andrew, isn't there a group that in the west of France that also had a separate language and has been fighting for its separate identity as well?
West of France. I don't know off the top of my head. I'm sorry. I know that the western area of France, there was always this sort of fuzzy borderline between Iberian Europe and Francophone Europe. So that's what I meant. The Basque.
Okay, well, we'll stick with the Basque and the Corsicans. In any event, they clearly have a separate language and a separate culture and have fought to maintain it, but there has always been a strong assimilationist policy on the part of France, particularly Paris, and so their attempts to maintain their separate identity have always been less than fruitful. But the argument has always been made, yes, it would hurt. Assimilation hurts for a generation, possibly two, but if you really follow it through and you get the job done, then they were actually better off, and there are still certainly people who continue to argue that indigenous folks would be better off if they had simply been assimilated. Let's look at it rather than from an ethical perspective, because we already did all the shit that we did. We already hurt them horribly. We've done, we took their land, etc., etc. Let's look at it then from a truly pragmatic perspective. Would they be better off? Is anybody willing to make the argument that they would be better off if they were just citizens like all other citizens? Wow, that bought silence. Think of it as the equivalent of a disease. We've done this horrible thing. We have hurt this person or this group of people maliciously. We've stolen their lands from them. We've not permitted them to exercise rights. And what we are disposed to do now is here we've harmed these people, and we want to fix the harm we've done. And we're trying to figure out, quite apart from how we did the harm and whether that was right or wrong, we'll admit it was wrong, how do we best help them now? Because the argument has long been made that the best way to help them, and certainly it was the argument that was made immediately after Brown, was get them the hell off the reservation, integrate them, assimilate them, and make them an equal part of society, rather than have our relationship continue to be consociational in nature. In any event, it is an argument. It was a sincerely made argument by people who were sincere about wishing for the welfare of indigenous peoples. I do not think that they were all... There was a statement made before Congress, or a speech made before Congress, somewhere around the turn of last century, where a congressman stood up and said that, I forget the precise words at this moment, but basically it wasn't enough to, we had killed a sufficiently large number of Indians by that time. But certainly it constituted genocide. But the reality is we didn't want to just kill the Indians, but we wanted to kill their culture. And if I am able to recall the exact line, hopefully I will be able to shortly, I will send it along to you. Anyway, so There are crucial differences between the case of discrimination then against Black Americans, at least from an ethical perspective, and the special status granted to Indigenous Canadians. Indigenous peoples did not see their status as a badge of inferiority. They actually preferred to remain separate. So the Brown Court is, and it is notable, and if you read the Brown language closely, you will find that this is so. The Brown Court itself did not universally reject the concept of separate but equal. It narrowly tailored its opinion to the factual circumstances of the impact of segregation on African Americans. The Indigenous peoples of Canada regarded segregation as a defense of their highly valued cultural heritage. It was forced assimilation that they viewed as a badge of inferiority. Indeed, the emotional impact on Indigenous American children who were forcibly assimilated was very like the impact that enforced segregation had on African American children. Indigenous or Aboriginal groups have, however, demanded the statement was the only good Indian was a dead Indian, but they did not mean dead as in physically dead, but dead that they were culturally dead. Anyway, Indigenous or Aboriginal groups have, however, demanded only those restrictions that they believe are necessary to protect their communities. There is substantial evidence that when the land upon which Aboriginal communities are based becomes desirable for white settlement and development, and this goes back to the oil issue, right, Laura? The only thing which has prevented the undesirable disintegration of Indigenous communities has been the legally entrenched non-alienability of the land. Does anybody know what the meaning is of alienability? Anyone?
I don't, but I just wanted to tell you I got a text from Grant saying that he's at the emergency room, which is why he's not here.
Oh dear God, I'm so sorry. Did we know why?
I think something happened to his girlfriend. I think he's okay. He said to take his girlfriend to the emergency room. I said I would let you know. He was texting me.
Okay, well, gosh, wow, I'm so sorry. Anyway, alienability basically means that you have a piece of land that's privately owned and you can alienate it. That is to say, you can sell it on the open market. So what we did, or in connection with Indigenous communities here in the United States and also in Canada, what we call reservations, means that they were lands that were reserved for the exclusive inhabitation of Indigenous peoples, and they were owned communally, and that they could not be broken up and sold off. So they were non-alienable. And the best way for whites to, the reality was that the best way for whites to take over the land was to legislate that it was alienable and therefore subject to sale, and then outbid Indigenous peoples for their own land. And in other words, it was impossible for Indigenous peoples to retain their land by that means. So the effect has been to destroy Indigenous cultures in order to protect the mobility of non-Indigenous Americans and Canadians. Okay, so it's 1:30 now. Let's take a break and we'll be back in 5, okay? Does that go with everyone? You can go off and do whatever you want to do. I see you have a wonderful refrigerator back there, and I'm sure you're going to run back there and grab some. Okay.
Are you pointing at me?
I am! I can see your refrigerator back there. You're on my screen right now.
I'm going to turn off the video.
Okay, see you in a minute, guys.
Did we hang up?
No, don't hang up! You just have 5 minutes, do what you will.
Hey, Laura.
Thanks for telling me I was on mute that one time.
It was really funny. You were like,
I was just saying words. So I'm glad I got a second chance.
Makes sense. I wonder who she meant other than the boss.
Hmm?
Yeah, people that are off, actually. The French thing, I wonder who she meant. She didn't mean the bus. Got the biscuits.
I don't know what she was looking for there.
Can I turn my video off now? Do you think the fridge thing is a good excuse? I've been eating my apple as well, so I keep being really like self-conscious. I'm like, no.
Most of the time, I can't see anybody but her.
And then when someone
And
else
every
starts to
now
speak,
and
it's
then
like,
you just pop up, and then your face is there, and I don't know why. I don't know what prompts that.
I think Skype tries to detect who's speaking.
Oh, that's weird.
Because you pop up whenever you start talking about Canada, you pop up.
Okay.
And go.
That's a good sound. Whatever that is.
Oh, your video's gone.
Yeah, that was intentional. Yeah, I've had 2 people hang up noises.
Are people hanging up? Oh, there's 10 in call now.
Yeah. Grant sent me a text. Grant says she'll be okay. She's fine.
Okay, that's good.
Something that happens frequently has happened. It's not. She's not been hit by a car or anything.
That's good. I really feel like we should do our classes like this more often.
We all love
Who's saying that? I find that all the disembodied voices are so funny.
It's Alexis. I have my camera off because once I found out this class was canceled, I have not moved from bed today.
I just need to turn my camera off because, like, Matt and Laura keep making me laugh. And Bonnie's there going indigenous peoples, and I'm like...
I was just eating a sandwich. I think between your apple and my sandwich, it's comical for her to watch.
Honestly, consider yourselves very lucky that you don't have to stare at my doofy mug all day. This is great.
So you guys think you'd like internet courses?
On people, though.
Say again?
I'm not excited that she's just randomly calling on people.
Yeah, I'm glad
I
I
was-
But I always randomly call on
not
people.
posing that question. Like, even a little bit.
So back to the question of assimilation. Does anybody see? I actually obviously wrote my dissertation supporting the opposite view. But does anybody see that it might in some sense be equitable, or are you all going, yeah, but not with regard to indigenous people? Doris!
Yes?
I'm sorry, but I can't. I asked for Doris and I got RX. Doris?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
It's weird because people's faces just pop up. Okay. So, anyway, so what do you think? Can you argue for, or RX, did you want to speak to it?
Sorry, I didn't hear the question. So what's the question?
What is there, can you mount a defense for assimilation and why it might be a good thing rather than a bad thing? I know that China's policy has been one of assimilation.
Yes, our policy is kind of assimilation, but we do have this privilege for the minority group. So, like, we give you the opportunity to, we ask you, we require you to have a general education, and we try to instill the culture of majority to you, but at the same time, we have this privilege for you, so you can feel the respect of the society.
Right.
So, yeah, so I think assimilation is just to give opportunity to the member of the minority group so they can choose to be a part of the larger society, or they stay their own culture, they maintain their own culture. But I think if you give there too much autonomy, then the leader of this minority group may not allow the members to be assimilated, to be a part of a larger society.
So that is the question of exit, the right to exit. That is to say that members of the group have the right to exit and become part of the larger society. And yes, the issue has been raised in the literature that in a very cohesive minority group, individuals are not permitted to make that choice, and when they make that choice, they are completely alienated from the group of which they were a part, and I think we discussed that a bit as well. Anyway, moving along, African American integration versus Indigenous American separation. Somebody needs to mute again, please.
Oh, God.
It should at this point be apparent that equitable considerations concerning African American and Indigenous Americans are substantially different. Both approaches have respect for the individual in mind. There are, however, two different conceptions of equal respect at work. To respect Indigenous peoples as members of distinct cultural communities, the state must recognize the importance of their cultural heritage and must recognize claims made by them for the protection of that culture. If Canada treats their land rights as the same as all Canadians, then the result will be the loss of cultural membership. However, to give Indigenous people special consideration imposes burdens on non-Indigenous peoples. There is a genuine conflict, and that is respecting persons as citizens and respecting them as members of cultural communities. Many liberal theories, especially those of American origin, don't recognize one half of the dilemma because they give no independent weight to cultural membership. No differences are permitted between citizens in the field of opportunity. The nature of individuals in a liberal democracy is that they are interchangeable. Differences arise only on the basis of individual choices. Kimlicka thinks that the best approach to the dilemma is to show how liberal democratic theory can in fact be harmonized with minority rights. The goal is not to treat minority rights as competing with liberal theory, but rather as an essential element of liberal political practice. So the question that we must begin with, if we're going to try to harmonize these two areas of political theory, is the value of cultural membership. And as we established, everyone needs a culture in which to function, or perhaps we didn't and we should now. Everyone needs a culture in which to function. Why do we have to have a culture? What is so essential about a culture? I mean, you know, we constantly hear about cultural wars, we hear about all of these issues. We know that certainly culture is a very political question. But why do we have to have a culture? Anybody?
Is it because it rallies people around a certain ideology?
No, actually, I mean, it may also have that effect. Was that Alexis?
That was Alexis.
It may have that effect. Certainly, if part of the culture is nationalism, it may have that effect. But why, think in pragmatic terms, you're a child. Why do you have to have a culture?
It's the person's sort of background.
Is that Nadia?
The formation of their own personal identity.
Okay.
And it shapes who they are.
Okay, it shapes who they are, but think in even more pragmatic terms. If you're an individual, you're Robinson Crusoe, you're on an island all by yourself. Let's suppose you got shipwrecked when you were a child rather than an adult. You're on an island all by yourself. Do you need a culture? What do you need a culture for?
Isn't it about unification of peoples? Like trying to make people have a sense of like community and to connect a country.
But why do we care about community? What's important about it, Lily?
So that you can govern people.
Okay, to some degree, but let's take it down a couple of steps. You're just walking down the street. And there's a lot of people on the street. Why do you need a culture? What is it for?
Culture determines what is appropriate among different people.
Who was that?
Oh, Laura.
Hi, Laura. Okay, you're getting there. Say that again.
It sets norms and values about what's appropriate in society.
So you're walking down the street, and you have a shared culture with the people on that street. So what does that do for you?
Sorry.
Linda is typing.
Oh, sorry. No. It sort of gives you a way to organize people into different sects of society. So
Why do you need to do that? No. You guys are getting off on political theory. Let's get down to basics. What do you need a culture for? Article 27 protects language, it protects religion, and it protects culture, where culture really subsumes language and religion. So what do you need a culture for?
So I guess culture is sort of the medium through which people relate to each other and through which they connect and understand the broader world. So without a cultural context with which people can interact and relate to each other, then it's essentially an ad hoc interaction every single time. Like assuming there's a world where there would be no like shared culture among peoples, then every single time a person would have to interact, then they'd have to establish new sort of understandings of like where another person is coming from, what languages this person speaking.
So the reality is that you have a shared culture and you have expectations. So if I'm an American, my husband just thinks this is absurd, but it's true nonetheless. In America, everything has tags on it, right? In the stores, there's a price. You take the price as given, and you go to the counter and you pay for it, right?
Right.
Okay, so now all of a sudden we're in a bazaar, a Middle Eastern bazaar. Are you confused? How do you relate to the people in the market?
Well, I would probably hopefully go with someone who speaks the language, who has an understanding of the bazaar, someone who is familiar with like just sort of the practice of shopping at such a space, as someone who is personally unfamiliar and doesn't come from that same cultural context.
You would be completely lost, right? So you're missing the language. You're missing the way that bargains are carried out. You don't just take a price in that situation. You make an offer, they respond, you bargain, and you arrive at a price, and then you pay, and you take away what you've bargained for, right? So that's a very, very, very different culture from Americans who go shopping at the mall. Isn't that true? I mean, in America, basically, the only thing you really bargain for are probably houses and cars, right? I mean, the average American. So we don't have that sort of cultural aspect, if you will, that enables us to know actually how to operate in a bazaar, and of course add to that the fact that we don't share a language, and basically we're completely incompetent in that situation, right?
Right.
So what then does culture do for us?
It sort of like establishes commonalities among people so that people can interact more efficiently and create understandings between people.
So you can have expectations that if I do this, they'll do that. If I do this, they'll do that, etc., right?
Right.
So it limits the number of possible responses, and we have some concept of how to act vis-a-vis a perfect stranger. And obviously this becomes increasingly important the larger the group of people that we're interacting with, right? So if I live in a very small town, a small social setting, the rules are perhaps not as important and are subject to change much more easily than if I live in a very large urban environment, right? Because I know all the people in my little town. So our relationship is more familial, perhaps, than it is a relationship between strangers. So we can go ahead, we can sit down, we can chat, we can reach an agreement about one thing or another, we can shake on it, and we can walk away, and everybody knows that they can rely upon that agreement, because everybody knows the other people in the town, right?
Right.
So the larger the group of people, the more important a shared culture becomes, because we cannot rely upon sort of those handshake agreements that we would rely upon if we lived in a small town. So that is why we must have culture. I mean, we could go on about that. Shared language is enormously important. Norms are enormously important. Being able to have expectations. Remember, the most important thing that the law provides is predictability, right? And that is basically what culture does in a more sort of general way. It's provide predictability. We know how to interact with other people. So everyone needs a culture. We need a language. We have to be able to communicate. We need norms. We have to know how other people are going to behave vis-a-vis us and how we are to behave vis-a-vis them. And this is a position to which all major liberal theorists agree. The central question for minority protection is whether minority members are entitled to access to their own culture as opposed to a culture of the dominant majority. Kimlicka's most famous contribution in the field of minority rights is his conception of culture as a context of choice. He uses the term culture in a very particular way. By it he means the cultural community or the cultural structure itself. He is rejecting the notion that culture is only the high culture of the elite. So basically he's adopted an anthropological conception of culture. Concern for culture as a context of choice accords with the liberal concern for our ability and freedom to judge the value of our own life plans. Hence, concern for the value of cultural membership is not, in fact, illiberal if one is prepared to acknowledge that we must have a culture. But the central issue of minority protection is why an individual needs access to his own culture as opposed to the culture of the dominant majority. If one does not require access to a particular culture in order to function and to survive, but merely needs access to a culture, one culture only, then what claim does any minority group have to the protection of its own culture as opposed to the culture of the dominant majority? People are bound in an important way to their own cultural community, he argues. One can't just transplant people from one culture to another, even if we provide the opportunity to learn the other's language and culture, and even though some people adopt another culture voluntarily. Someone's upbringing isn't something that can simply be erased. Kimlicka acknowledges that one's upbringing is a constitutive part of who someone is. Cultural heritage, in the sense of belonging to a cultural structure and history, is often cited as a source of emotional security and indeed personal strength. A cultural structure is crucial not only to the pursuit of our chosen ends, but also to the very sense that we are able to pursue them efficiently. And I think, Matt, you were the one who introduced the word efficiency. Indeed, people are reluctant to give up their cultural association, even in the face of negative costs to membership, for instance, discrimination or economic costs. I'm trying to think who was speaking the other day. But somebody was saying, we were talking about the loss of language and the fact that there are at least some people who are prepared to pay the price, both in terms of discrimination and certainly in terms of economic costs, in order to retain their language in the United States, despite the economic pressure to give priority to learning English and having the loss of language that follows, certainly over generations. Enforced assimilation can have tragic results even when its intentions are benign. So somebody then who is prepared to hold on to their culture and absorb the economic impact of doing so is basically someone who has chosen not to be assimilated and does not want to exit their group. Enforced assimilation can have tragic results even when its intentions are benign, and that's what I keep on talking about when Canadians were attempting to apply Brown to the case of Indigenous Canadians. This has been especially true, of course, of Indigenous peoples. When an individual is stripped of his cultural heritage, then his development is literally stunted. For these reasons, we should interpret the primary good of cultural membership as referring to the individual's own cultural community rather than the culture of another group, particularly the dominant majority. So we're talking then, as I've said before, we have at issue two different kinds of equality. We have equality of individuals, and we have equality of cultures. If individuals are to be entitled to access to their own cultures, how does the state ensure that the culture is still there? And I know that Andrew spoke to this last week. The problem is that minority groups can be outbid both in the economic market and in the political process by the majority, even as to matters that are crucial to their group. Special rights are needed to treat Aboriginal people with the respect owed to them as members of a cultural community. To do so, liberals fear that it may mean compromising the fairness of political and economic procedures. Now, I should note, when they make that argument, they're not talking about the fairness relative to Indigenous people. They're talking about the fairness to everybody else who's not a member of that group. Indigenous rights entail special costs for other people by restricting rights and resources of non-Indigenous peoples. This would be unfair, Kimlicka argues, if society were merely promoting the chosen projects of Indigenous peoples. It would constitute an unfair use of political power to insulate them from the market pressures to which all others are subject. Indigenous rights are not, however, the product of shared choices, but rather of unequal circumstances. Notably, the unequal circumstances that we ourselves created, that is to say, the dominant majority. Indigenous peoples are forced to bear costs of securing their cultural membership that are additional to the cost of merely conducting their individual lives, where cultural membership is necessary to make sense of their lives, and where the same benefit is free to majority cultures. Remember when we talked before about you're walking down the street, and if you're walking down the street and you are Anglo-assimilated American, then everything that you see supports your culture. But if you are an Indigenous person, you're walking down that same street, what do you find that supports your culture? Anything?
Not really much.
No, basically no. There is nothing there for you. I mean, there may be some specialty shop you could go into that actually meets your cultural needs, but basically, yeah, there's nothing there for you. So these facts are true regardless of the choices that Indigenous peoples make, either as a group or as groups of individuals. So the point is that we're not talking about people who, for instance, let's say, I don't know, choose not to pursue a job because they want to do something else with their time. And so they suffer as a product of that. We're talking about people who were born to a particular culture, and that culture is not free to them in the way that our culture is free to us. That is the dominant majority. So special measures correct a disadvantage to Indigenous peoples that occurs even before they are able to make any individual choices. Non-Indigenous peoples have access to their cultures for free. It is necessary to Indigenous peoples to outbid non-Indigenous peoples just to ensure their very survival. This leaves individuals within those cultural structures with few resources to pursue the goals that they have chosen as individuals. Special political rights can control this inequality by removing obstacles to their culture before they are even able to make their choices based upon their cultural context of choice. So plainly, these rights in the Indigenous case include the protection of land, the grant of some form of self-government, and the dedication of state resources to the support of the Indigenous culture. So what do you think? Do you have any comments at this point? What do you think about Kimlicka? Because that basically is where we're going to end with him. Is he right, wrong? Are you indifferent? Do you need to think about it? Wow, not a word, not a peep. So we have no thoughts? Are we people without thoughts in here? Anyway, I think it is something worth thinking about. It is not the issue that usually gets addressed in political theory courses, although perhaps it ought to be. So hang on, I seem to have put away something I meant to take out. I'll be right back. Okay, anyway, so obviously Donnelly rejects the entire idea of minority rights. He thinks it's a bad idea. He thinks we should be considering a different approach entirely. He then takes completely the opposite view, that we should not, in fact, have groups that have rights, but rather we should have only individual rights. And of course, the only case that is excluded from that is the right to, it would be self-determination. But as we've also discussed in the case of self-determination, it is not what it once was. Self-determination used to be about individual groups. It was obviously embraced during the decolonization period, and the idea is that colonies abroad, that is blue water colonies, should be able to sever their relationship with the colonial state. And then basically what developed after that was that self-determination meant that a government adequately represented all of its people. And so if there were groups of people, identifiable groups of people whose rights were not adequately protected, then they could sever their relationship with the larger group. Anyway, I'm sorry I'm looking away from the camera, but I'm not finding some of the things that I had hoped to find here. Anyway, what happened then was, in that event, and only in that event, if we had a minority group that was whose rights were plainly being violated, then they might have some authority to exercise self-determination separate from the larger group of which they were, or the larger state of which they were a part. And I'm not finding the particular, excuse me, I'm sorry for that brief diversion. I didn't include in your materials the particular UN document that supports that argument. Anyway, so did anybody have an opportunity to read the Rogers Brubaker article or the Paula and Simone? Well, actually, we talked about Paula and Simone. Did anybody read Rogers Brubaker? No? Basically, his argument is, and this has sort of been what has been going on for a number of years, that in fact assimilation is not a bad thing, that it's actually a good thing. And the only point that he makes is he is agnostic as to the outcome. So assimilation could take many paths. One could, as a product of assimilation, obviously as you assimilate new groups of people, then the culture to some degree changes as they bring with them some of their own beliefs and understandings and cultural forms. So the point is that he's agnostic as to what the outcome should be, whether a culture should remain pristine, as the French tend to prefer, or whether the culture should undergo change, as at least has been the historical truth of the American culture over time as a product of assimilating new groups. In either event, however that assimilation process proceeds, his argument is that it is a better choice than minority group rights. And as I've already said, Jack Donnelly also takes that position. So here's the next question. We've seen what happens, at least in the case of indigenous peoples, as Zahra wrote, who were treated inequitably and unjustly, and that it had devastating consequences for the members of that group. What if we are talking, let's take that to a new level, or another level, not a new level, another level, it's actually an old level. What if we're talking about genocide or ethnic cleansing, where those two concepts are very closely related? Has everybody read the Genocide Convention? If you have not, you should. Please read it. What is the basic thing that the Genocide Convention protects? I can't believe this. Do I not have the Genocide Convention in here? I'm going to send you a copy of the Genocide Convention if I did not in fact include it, because it most certainly should be there. Anyway, what the Genocide Convention protects is the right of a group simply to exist. I think what happened is I put it in the humanitarian law section and did not include it in this section. So I'm going to send it along to you, and I think you should read it, and I think you should read it not least because it will be relevant to the examination in terms of, from a human rights perspective, does a group have a continuing right to exist? You should note that there have been two conceptions of genocide. One is cultural and one is physical. So the point is here, let's start by saying that the right to exist is arguably the most important minority right. It has to come, that is to say physical existence, it has to come before the right to preserve one's culture intact. But if you look at the history of the Genocide Convention, originally there were two concepts involved. One was protection against cultural genocide, and one was the protection against physical genocide, where eventually what happened is as the negotiations on the Genocide Convention continued, the concept of cultural genocide was shunted aside with all but one case, the exception of one case, and that was the fact that children could not be taken away from their families, as happened in Canada and has happened also in the United States vis-a-vis Indigenous people, in order forcibly to be assimilated. So we included that as part of the Genocide Convention, but more broadly the mere protection of cultures, languages, and religions got shunted into a different category, and that of course was minority rights. Cultural genocide was not deemed to have sort of the equivalent or exist on the same moral plane as physical genocide, and so they decided to treat it separately, with that single exception of taking children and forcibly assimilate from their parents and forcibly assimilating them into another culture. So for some reason, in the course of those negotiations, the theft of children seemed to be given the same gravitas as killing individual members of the group, with the intent to eliminate the group entirely. Nonetheless, what we cannot do is address minority rights without considering the first minority right, and that is the right to exist. So the term genocide literally means a killing of a people, where geno is a people and side is killing, one being Greek and one being Latin. Until its invention, genocide was described by Winston Churchill as a crime without a name, but it was certainly a crime with a very long history. It has been practiced across time and space. Some of the first genocides, that is of the root and branch variety, were described in what has come to be known as the Hebrew Bible by some. And I'm sorry, I have the correct Hebrew name in our test, and I have lost it again. But basically, the most ancient texts, particularly the Pentateuch, describe the practice of genocide. So genocide and its first cousin, ethnic cleansing, have been practiced on every inhabited continent of the world by virtually every people at some time or another. And I should note also, just as an aside, it is not true that one can only commit a genocide against a minority. The fact of the matter is that during the Mongol Empire, and RX should probably be familiar with this, there was a point where the Mongolians were contemplating the complete genocide of the Chinese people so as to take their land but eliminate the Chinese from the land. Ultimately, they decided against it, and what happened then is, of course, the Mongol Empire fragmented into pieces, where China became an independent piece and eventually became Sinified once again. The Mongols there embraced the Chinese culture and became, for all intents and purposes, Chinese. So in that event, what we're really talking about is a genocide of a vast majority, rather than the genocide of minorities. So that is a possible outcome. So as we know, Donnelly suggests that any mass killing should be deemed genocide, and that really goes to a second great debate in connection with the Genocide Convention, and that is what groups should be included in the list of groups subject to genocide. The big issue was whether the slaughter of political minorities should be deemed a genocide. Donnelly argues that this should be, that it should, although it would be, he would term it politicide rather than genocide. The decision was taken that politicide was different, excuse me, from genocide, in as much as the association with a political group was voluntary, whereas the association with other groups named was involuntary or ascribed. Obviously, this is not always clear in connection with religious minorities, although it is often the case that a religion is associated with a particular ethnic group. But as to racial and ethnic groups, this pretty much is beyond cavil. Still, under the influence of constructivism, the notion that ethnic groups even exist has, of course, been challenged. So, just a couple of words on Donnelly's discussion of humanitarian intervention. He writes, and I would agree, that multilateral humanitarian interventions launched by the Security Council are no longer the subject of controversy. It is no longer a question whether the Security Council can intervene in the event of a genocide. The only question is whether in fact it will. The real controversy surrounds the question as to whether individual states may intervene without the permission of the Security Council. Both Donnelly and Higgins, and if you are still here for the humanitarian law course, argue that unilateral humanitarian intervention should be permitted. The Security Council may hesitate to intervene in a particular genocidal conflict for a variety of reasons, and in some instances they never will, or they will do so too late, as was the case with Rwanda. Hence, both Donnelly and Higgins maintain that unilateral intervention should be permitted where the Security Council fails to do what is right. What I thought was particularly interesting about his take is that he rejects the notion that a responsibility to protect actually exists. Obviously, this is true insofar as there's tremendous inconsistency as to when the UN does and does not intervene. Instead, he refers to the right to protect, that is, the right of individual states to intervene where the UN fails. He appears to believe that right exists, although it should be subject to greater scrutiny than multilateral intervention, because the latter is likely to actually to be humanitarian in nature. That is to say, multilateral intervention is likely to be driven by humanitarian concerns, whereas unilateral intervention is more likely to be driven by, although I would suggest not exclusively and not always, but is more likely to be driven by political concerns like regional hegemony. But even as to the claim that the Security Council would be more likely to be driven by humanitarian concerns, probably that is naive. The Security Council is subject to the vetoes of the 5 permanent members, and they will act largely in their own interest when voting on a proposed intervention, hence the inconsistency in terms of intervening in the event of genocide that is either about to occur or that is actually occurring. His example is, nonetheless, the fear has always been that unilateral intervention, as I said, is more likely to be guided by national interests, and his example is the Vietnamese intervention in Cambodia, which he insists was not motivated by humanitarian concerns. To the degree that it had a humanitarian outcome, he maintains it was merely accidental. It is for this reason that he felt that states intervening must justify the intervention. So do you think, is anybody knowledgeable about the intervention in Cambodia? Does anybody know anything about the Cambodian situation? Anyone? It was called The Killing Fields, and there's a great movie by that name. And basically, it involved the Khmer Rouge, which was a Stalinist communist organization, wiping out, slaughtering untold numbers of people who, in fact, disagreed with their national policy, such as it was. It was. I'm sorry?
Oh, I was just gonna say, wasn't it, did they wipe out almost like a fourth of the population through like
You know,
mass killing?
Alexis, I would have to go back and look that up, but it was absolutely outrageous, the number of people that were wiped out. And of course, the question was it a genuine genocide? Because they were not necessarily wiping out a particular group, they were just wiping out all political opponents. So probably it was more like unto a politicide than it was like unto a genocide. But with the same outcome. I mean, they were stacking bodies like cordwood, literally. I'm sure, Alexis, you've seen the pictures of literally the rows of skulls stacked one on top of the other?
Yeah, I have. I guess I would think it would fall under the realm of politicide, but yeah, I guess that's my only takeaway, that I think it would fall under the realm because it's not a specific minority group that was targeted.
Right.
And because it was such a vast population done for political reasons, that would make the most amount of sense. But
it was almost like Alexis, you sound as if you know something about it. Wasn't it almost like a suicide?
I don't know if it was a suicide. I mean, it sounds like, so from what I remember, it was a mixture of different ways that they committed these horrendous acts. It was through mass killings, but then it was also through malnutrition and the spread of disease. And so, if you weren't slaughtered, you were subjected to inhumane living conditions, which led to your death also. And that's how I remember the genocide taking place, or the genocide taking.
It was, in short, horrific. And of course, the great debate is whether the word genocide should have been applied. But I think the alternative debate is, should the Genocide Convention be amended to include wiping out of groups that are not defined specifically by ethnicity or race or religion. And so hopefully, or perhaps one day we will do that. Perhaps there should be a protocol to the Genocide Convention, because certainly these were issues that were debated at the time that the Genocide Convention was being negotiated. And then, of course, they, as I said, limited to this small group of groups, if you will. I should also, I'm sorry, I just lost that thought. I was just going to say, I should have, and I regret I didn't remember to include it in the syllabus for this year. I should have included the Genocide Convention, because you should know, and this is largely a product of what happened during the Nazi era. The genocide obviously can take place both in times of quote-unquote international peace and also in times of international war. The fact of the matter was that the Nazi genocide, including Roma, including obviously Jews, but also including gay people and sundry other groups of individuals that they wanted to offload, the mentally ill, the mentally disabled, etc., etc., etc. So this genocide began before war was underway. Hence, the protections of the Genocide Convention fall squarely between human rights and humanitarian law. It in fact applies in both situations and should be deemed, therefore, also a matter of human rights. And going back to the exam, one of the big issues is, of course, the conflict between the rights of Angela as an individual and the rights of minority groups, where obviously Angela has been interpreted to be in an America comprised primarily of Christians, to be a Christian figure, and what the impact will be if in fact she is used to promote that a Christian agenda. And obviously this is the most divisive, and I'm not specifically speaking of Angela, but this is obviously the most divisive issue in American society. This is what the culture wars are about. Whether religious viewpoints should, particularly Christian religious viewpoints, should continue to be dominant, or whether, you know, there should be sort of a harmony of alternative viewpoints as well, and what all that means. In any event, it's 2:19. We're finished with, I'm going to send you a copy of the Genocide Convention, or at least a site that has it. Let's take a brief break, and then we'll finish up. We're going to start on women's rights as human rights, which is not on the test, but we're already behind. It would otherwise have been. And I'd like to start that with maybe a discussion of the current Hollywood controversy, okay? So 5 minutes, guys, and I'll be right back. Okay, so I'm back. You guys turn on your microphones. And I know that one of us was not happy with me choosing you arbitrarily, so the only way you can raise your hand is simply to speak up. What do you think about Harvey Weinstein and what's happening, the meltdown in Hollywood?
That's not a lot of do. But it's also sort of like, oh wait, are the microphone issues? Okay. Yeah. Okay. I'm gonna put this on. Yeah. All right. Yeah. Anyways, yeah.
Who's speaking?
Nadia.
Hi, Nadia. Nadia, so tell me what you think.
Sorry. Anyways, what I was saying was. Does that help? Or...
Sorry.
Yeah, I can. Oh, okay. Do you think I should just go on repeat or something? Yeah, I think that's better. Yeah. Okay. Here's Nadia.
Yay!
Anyways, yeah, what I was saying was, it's long overdue, but I can also understand why there was so much hesitation because I think this has been an issue that's just been so prevalent behind the scenes. And I assume that quite a lot of the people involved just chose to accept that this is a part of the sacrifice of survival in this industry. And it shouldn't be this way, no. But I just feel like everything's just snowballing because floodgates have opened and there's this security now that so many people have spoken up that my voice is just one of the pillars, I guess. Whereas, 10 years ago, if you were the sole person to say, hey, I'm the struggling actress, this powerful producer came onto me, highly likely you're going to lose a job and you weren't going to have a lot of support because other struggling actresses weren't going to give up their dream to just, support you. It wasn't within their favor. So
basically,
a couple people really sacrificed their sort of like position as a what is it, like field, I guess, like Rose McGowan, I think was one of the first ones to say, well, I probably know that I'm not going to work in Hollywood again, but here you go. And for other people just say, well, look, my career is in a secure place right now, I can finally say something.
So you think it was all about the fact that the people who spoke had secure careers and they could afford to speak?
I think people are really concerned about job security more than anything. And they realize that so that people talk to scenes and people have confided with each other that this is what happened to me, has it happened to you? And just keeping the general consensus that if one of us opens our mouths, that's it for me. It's one person versus like a powerful sort of like unspoken ethic going on.
But if everybody spoke at the same time, then one could expect change.
I would say that you really need a catalyst of some sort, and a catalyst that...
The Me Too catalyst.
At least two, at least one, but yeah, it was more than just one. So you realize that there's sort of like an equal power dynamic going on, where it's not just one person who's at a clear disadvantage if she decides to speak up. They actually he even as well.
What do you think, Andrew, you're a guy, so I'm going to ask you to speak to it a bit. Do you have, one of the things that was brought up today, it came out in the New York Times apparently this morning. What is the guy's name who did Kill Bill?
What's his name?
Quentin Tarantino.
Thank you, yeah.
It's Quentin Tarantino. He said that he knew a lot and heard stories throughout the years, but decided not to do anything.
And of course, part of it was that he had a partnership with. Part of it was that he had a partnership with this guy, right? But what I thought was interesting is he said that what they had described, and apparently his own girlfriend was a victim of this. He minimized it. He didn't think it was a big deal. He just thought it was how things were. And I thought that was very interesting, and I must say, I had years ago, we've since sort of gone our own way, but I had a close friend who was sort of a product of the 60s as I was a product of the 70s. At least my teenage years were during the 70s. And, you know, she said, you know, women expected people to sort of, you know, be handsy and come at them, and, you know, the chasing around the desk and the whole routine. And this Quentin fellow said very much the same thing. What you know, he minimized it because it was ordinary, it was accepted, it was just how things were. So again, Andrew, just because you're a guy here, what do you think of it? Do you have any view? Do you understand where Quentin was coming from, or do you think that's completely outrageous?
I do think it's outrageous, but I don't think it's completely not understandable. I think when somebody's young in a certain industry, they're so worried. There's like this pressure to just sort of socialize so you can make it. But I also think as a thinking person, you should still put your morality first above your any career aspirations that you might have and challenge this cultural status quo in any type of industry. I know that's what I would definitely hope I'd be able to do. But I also agree with a lot of the commentary that's been coming out of it that it really is, the onus is really on us men to act better and never engage in the type of behavior that Weinstein and others are engaging in. So
really, I mean, you know, I think you're exactly right on there. If you look back in time, for instance, how did women get the right to vote? Obviously, since they didn't have the right to vote, they couldn't vote to have the right to vote. So plainly, it required men agreeing that, you know, it was just that women should be able to vote in the context of a democracy. Similarly, if you want a culture to change where clearly there's a power structure where men have greater power than women, necessarily men have to take a stand and they have to oppose this kind of behavior. But is it not also true? You know, you say you would like to believe that's who you would be, but isn't it true that it's kind of scary to stand up, even if you're a guy, against all other guys and say, you know, hey, this is bad behavior and we shouldn't permit it? Isn't that difficult?
I guess it's absolutely difficult. But if you are somebody who really values being true to what you believe, I think you should find it in yourself to, in some ways, stand up against the status quo. And again, I'm not sure I'm like the best guy to ask about this because I don't in any way view women in like this way that leads people to be, you know, sexually harassed. I don't view anyone in that way. So I don't understand.
But let's go, if I may say. Also, his brother's now being attacked, and he supposedly sexually harassed other guys. So obviously, this is something that can happen in more than one way. And in the Me Too movement, there was at least one instance of a gay guy coming forward and saying, you know, I've been raped. So I mean, you know, this can happen in a lot of different ways. The power structure wreaks havoc. You know, when you know people are, you know, subordinate in any way. So I mean, if you go back in time to the civil rights movement, the fact of the matter is that white people who believed in the civil rights movement had great difficulty, particularly in the South, standing up for the civil rights movement. I'm thinking particularly of President Johnson's wife. As you know, Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act into existence, but the fact is his wife and I believe it was his daughter, did a whistle-stop campaign on his behalf in connection with that, and it was very scary because, you know, down south, because they were threatened. You know, with physical violence. You know, they had to have a great deal of security, and it was a very frightening thing to do. So, in this situation, oops, what happened?
Oh wait, I feel like
Did we?
My little dot just
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Are we back?
We're back. But
Okay, so wouldn't you
we
agree?
missed like the last maybe minute and a half of what you were saying because the computer was frozen.
Okay, so what I was saying before was that during the civil rights movement, white people had difficulty standing up and joining their voices in support of the civil rights movement. One of the things that happened was that Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act into law, and his wife and I believe daughter went down south on a whistle stop campaign in support of that decision, and were literally threatened with physical violence, and it was a very scary thing to do. Do you think it's plausible in this case, where somebody's career is on the line, like this this particular Hollywood producer, that they might in fact be threatened with greater harm than mere economic harm? I mean, is it that scary?
Well, yeah, I guess the idea of being faced with retaliation is through means of where like your work and your like personal health and safety is at stake could be a really big deterrent for standing up, and I think that's what we've seen for these women and during the civil rights movement as well. But and I know this is like, it's a very touchy issue because sexual assault against like sexual assault in any form is not okay, but the way that they're like Hollywood and men who knew about it and just sort of handled the situation, they were also accomplices to Harvey Weinstein and just like people during the civil rights movement who were hanging nooses on trees, and their neighbor saw it happen and didn't say anything. They were accomplices to the crime also.
So you think, I mentioned in the exam the case of, I can't believe I can't remember her name again, this just makes me crazy. The exam, where did I put the exam? The case of the woman, Kitty Genovese, who was killed as she approached her apartment building she was screaming and screaming, and she was being repeatedly stabbed by the person who assaulted her and ultimately murdered her. And everybody pulled down their shades and nobody picked up a phone to call the police. Were they accomplices? Did that make them legally accomplices?
I guess what I'm saying, accomplices, not in the legal sense, but in the moral sense. I don't think they could be legally held accountable for the actions because they didn't try to prevent or help the woman while she was killed. I think morally, while they stood by and didn't do anything, it's just questions into who they are and their character. That's what I meant when I was saying accomplice.
So you don't necessarily think they have a duty to step forward and put themselves at risk? In the case of Kitty Genovese, in the case of the civil rights movement, and now in the case of the whole scandal regarding sexual assault, you don't think they necessarily should have a legal duty to step forward?
I mean, it goes back to the issue. It goes back to the conversation we were having about Myanmar. Right? It's like who has the legal obligation to step forward and the moral obligation to step forward. I think they have a moral obligation to step forward. I don't think they have a legal obligation to step forward.
Particularly where their life is at risk. But what if it really is only economic risk rather than physical risk? Is that different? Should it be different?
I think people place more value. Some people may place more value on their economic standing. But I don't know. I've never been in a situation where I've had to either pick like my personal being harmed versus like economic standing. So I don't know. Maybe someone else can jump in.
Does anybody have a feeling about that?
Yeah, so, I'm sorry, should I just go on mute?
Was that Axon?
So, oh, there you go. So what I was saying was, couldn't you make the argument that self-preservation could have been a motive here as well for the Kitty Genovese case, the bystander case, I think it was, right? Where she was being stabbed and no one really helped her. Couldn't they have defended themselves by saying that this was a dangerous situation, didn't want to get involved?
Okay, so that would be a good excuse for not running down the stairs and running out into the plaza where she was being murdered. Would that be a good excuse for the situation?
No, I don't think it's morally. I mean, obviously, it's not the most morally sound.
I mean, we're talking. I mean, if the distinction is picking up the phone and calling the police.
That, I'm trying to live a day longer by not jumping into a dangerous situation where I'm the person is.
I mean, I hear what you're saying. If the actual issue was jumping in and physically protecting Kitty Genovese, then that seems like a very, very high bar to ask someone to meet. But if the issue is just picking up the damn phone and calling 911, what plausible excuse would you have for not doing so?
Right, and I think that is sort of like an indefensible. That would be the part where it's really indefensible. That no one really sort of thought, well, someone else is doing it or someone else isn't doing it. Let me jump in and be the hero of the situation. People probably just thought, well, someone else is probably taking care of it. I can just.
Oh, so you think that everybody in that community thought somebody else had already called 911? Would you risk that?
I think it's sort of like a human sort of not really big logic where you think someone else is taking care of something, or you hear a woman screaming at night, or you think maybe someone else has also heard that scream and already called 911, so I don't have to do anything. You know, I'm just. It's only an assumption to think that someone else has probably already thought that. You know, I'm not defending negligence, but I'm also saying that there is sort of like a logic to being negligent, if that makes sense.
Sure. I mean, again, I hear what you're saying. Since everybody was hearing the screaming, surely someone called. Would you take that risk? I think the correct answer is no, I wouldn't take that risk. I would definitely make the call anyway.
I can't say that every person hearing that scream would think, oh, someone was already also called 911. Let me just make sure.
Right. But in any event, I also think the key point here is that if you picked up the phone and you called 911, would your identity be protected? Because what if this guy is a known criminal on the block who's killing Kitty Genovese? What if I think, oh my God, if I make that call, this guy's going to know I made the call, that I'm going to stand as a witness against him, and now my life's at risk. Does that make a difference in your analysis?
I'm sorry, you're frozen right now.
You can't hear me again?
No, half of it was frozen, I'm sorry.
Okay, so what if the issue is my identity is not protected, this guy is a known criminal on the block, if I make the call, he will know I'm standing as witness against him, and he's going to come after me. Does that make a difference to your analysis?
I lost you after witness.
I'm standing as a witness against him. He will come after me.
Well, I'm sorry, we lost you after witness. You froze right after saying that there was a witness.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now.
Okay. If I stand as a witness against him, he'll come after me. Does that make a difference to you?
It depends to what level he would come after me.
Try to kill me.
If I wasn't within his earshot, if he couldn't really see me, I'm in my apartment and I can hear a woman screaming, yes, I would call 911.
But now you have to go to trial.
And he just comes right after.
Now you have to go to trial. Now you have to go to trial, Axon. You are being subpoenaed by the people. You have to stand in the witness box and testify against him. And let's suppose this is actually a mob guy who's killing Kitty Genovese. What then?
Well, I couldn't lie in court. So, I wouldn't really have much of an option but to do. Let me see.
Would you even pick up the call? If you knew this is a mob guy down there, would you even pick up the call? Or would you even pick up the, would you even call 911 and put yourself at risk if you are identified as a witness against him.
I think when you're also seeing some of the stuff, it's a sort of like sort of reaction that's a really quick, last second reaction. My personal reaction would have been to pick it up as fast as I could, without thinking about the reparations down the future. Oh, this is a mob guy. This could be a really powerful guy that could possibly harm me. It would have happened so fast that I would have really thought about it after I had done the action, as opposed to thinking, let me take the 5 minutes to think about what the positives and negatives would be in that situation, you know. And you can attest for this yourself. Like, a lot of decision making in this sort of like crucial time would be like within instantaneous. It wouldn't really be, oh, let me consider like 5 more minutes of thinking about whether this is the best decision to do right now for my own self-preservation.
So Andrew, what do you think? Does that change your analysis? In, you know, that you could come to physical harm if you step forward on behalf of a woman who was being assaulted?
Does it change my calculus on pride? You know, if I thought that I could sufficiently weather any type of physical harm that would come my way, I would still intervene. Like, if I was sizing up the guy and was like, okay, he's of comparable or lesser strength to me, like, I could, if we get into a fight, I could handle it, I would still, like, intervene, if that makes any sense.
That's such a man answer. Isn't that such a man
but it might be
answer?
different if the guy was, like, much stronger than me, could easily, like, break me in half, then I might be like, I don't know, if I'm being completely honest.
So seriously, you can say with integrity that you would have to consider whether you were a match to this guy.
I think that's sort of a reasonable way to approach the situation.
But what we're talking about...
Or if there were, like, other people around you, too, that you could, like, rally to this cause. You could be like, hey, this is a situation that's obviously bad, and we need to stop this guy from assaulting this woman.
But we're talking about, when we're talking about this Hollywood producer guy, okay, and what we know is he has a vast fortune at his disposal. And let's suppose he's not only going to blacklist you and force you out of Hollywood, but let's suppose that and this is speculation. In fact, it's not even speculation. It's hypothetical. But let's suppose that this guy, your assessment of his personality is that he would, if need be, have someone come to break your kneecaps or even put you out, or even give you concrete boots. Would that be different for you then? It's not just...
Yes, it would be. I mean, I hate to admit it, but if you felt like you could seriously get hurt, you would find a way to avoid that confrontation. And I think that's why in these instances when people feel that they're just up against insurmountable odds, they choose not to act, or maybe act in a way that isn't directly targeting the problem, but through more subversive means.
So really, when you consider the kind of power, and notably, just as an aside, the mob has always been actively involved in Hollywood to some greater or lesser degree. But when you consider the kind of money that's involved in Hollywood, at least has historically been, and you know, how much is on the line with every production, right? I mean, you make a movie, you've spent a lot of money to make the movie, and you've got to earn it back. And when there are some people who make a lot of money, who are good at making money, like apparently this producer was, and others who are not so much, then challenging this guy is more than difficult, right? I mean, it's downright scary because people will use violence to defend their economic interests, and that's just a fact. And it has always been a fact, mob aside, that people will use violence to defend their economic interests. So that's the scary reality, and I presume to some greater or lesser degree played a role in all of this. Anyway, so let's look at women's rights as human rights. We're not going to get very far. We've only got 10 minutes left, but the reality is that the rights of women pose problems for just about everything else and everyone else. Whether we're looking at the problems posed by freedom of religion, equal pay for equal work, abortion, what have you, women's rights are necessarily in the way of someone else's rights. We are constantly in competition. And this is a point I tried to make at the very start of the course, that the rights of various individuals are always in competition with other human rights. And it's particularly so when we're talking about women's rights, where women's, in fact, comprise, at least naturally comprise, over half of the human population. So if a woman, or if women are called upon to oppose male domination, does this raise any real problems, except insofar as it makes romantic relationships more different? Well, I had in my notes that probably not, but in truth, probably so. And this particular case demonstrates that yes, when women try to oppose male domination, there are real consequences above and beyond difficulties with romantic relations. But as an aside, it is not clear to me that we've ever really worked out what the correct relationship should be between women and men in a romantic relationship, if they are also equal. Presumably, if they want to reproduce, they will figure it out. I think what is much more distressing and I say the original reason why I wrote that in my notes is because, as we've seen, for instance, when women got the vote, it's because men supported it. If women are, if sexual assault is going to come to an end, it's going to be because men supported it, necessarily so. Though that is how change has historically been made for women, is because men have supported their cause. But what I think is much more distressing is the competition between women's rights and children's rights. And we're going to discuss this in connection with abortion, because it is obviously sort of like the issue in American society. But it's not certainly the only case or only instance where women's rights and children's rights come into competition. It is still clear that men on the whole expect women to be the primary caretakers of children in the family setting. The women that I know who are both mothers and professionals suffer from constant guilt if they are not at home with their children when they take their first step, when they formulate their first full sentence, or when they go off to kindergarten. If their child is sick and a woman has to work, the sense is that she abandoned her child. And that sense doesn't simply go away because of feminist rhetoric. On the other hand, if her husband or significant other does not step up to the plate, she and the society who judges her will find her wrong and not him. So there continues then to be this issue that, women are not permitted simply to walk away from their status as primary caretaker of their children. And so, even in that circumstance, even where the woman is the primary breadwinner in the household, her rights, her needs are in competition with her children. And for some reason, we find this more disturbing than we find the absentee father. Should that be so? Should there be equity in a home? Should men and women share equally in the care of their children? I mean, theoretically that seems obvious, but factually it's never been that. And still, if you speak to my colleagues, again, we're an older generation, it may be different for you folks, but still the fact of the matter is that she is expected to be there when the kid is sick, not him. Do you think that's true, Laura? I see you shaking your head. Do you want to speak?
I think that there is still a cultural expectation for that, at least
even now.
Well, yeah, because generationally, I think our parents, are part of the transition from that, away from stay-at-home moms being so normal. I think being a stay-at-home mom is a lot more socially acceptable and common than being a stay-at-home dad, and I think that is telling about just the relationship as it's expected to be. And I don't know I think that I would say our generation is moving away from that, because I think there's a lot more focus on women having a higher education and being able to pursue careers, but I don't know how that will play out for parenting as much.
XR, how is it in China? I can't hear you. You're on mute.
Sorry. I think in China we also have this clear division of work between husband and wife. Like, as a wife, you have the burden of the household chores, while as a husband, as long as you do your work, you earn money, then it's fine. And if the woman wants to go to work, you have to finish your household works. So otherwise, you will be seen irresponsible.
Even now. Would that be true if you were the primary breadwinner?
It's not the exact situation now, but there is still some influence to the society now. Yeah. It's like it's 2 decades ago. It's the status quo, but now it's like the society is improving, but still have this influence.
That women are the primary caretakers, regardless of whether they're bringing home, they're the primary breadwinners. They're still also the primary caretakers, right?
Yeah.
So let me ask you. I mean, any of you can respond to this. My mom was my primary caretaker. You know, if my mom abandoned me, I think that I would have been much more upset than if my father did. Is that still true? I mean, is there still the expectation among you as children of somebody that mommy has to be there, not necessarily dad?
Yes.
You think?
Definitely.
Oksana?
Yeah, I was gonna say that and just jump in and say, I think this idea sort of transcends culture and it's almost a global sort of biological thing so far that we're going through, which is that we sort of expect the woman to not break away completely from their matriarchal roles in society. That this is like come throughout time, that even though we can say that we're evolving, we're moving towards technology, women, moving away, shifting away from being always at home, and just, holding down a full-time job where the father can be part-time. There's always that expectation that the woman still has to make sure that the children are taken care of.
Let's go back to what you said, biological. Do you think it is biological? I mean, what is it? Is it merely that, we popped out of mommy's uterus? I mean, is that it? I mean, is there something here that is so fundamental that perhaps, changes in law and culture can't overcome it?
I think that's actually a very interesting debate, because I can't tell personally why I would sort of expect my mother to be near my bedside table if I'm in a hospital as opposed to my dad. It could be that we've just been sort of instilled from the very beginning that the mom's always going to be there and the dad can be outside working.
That soldiers in the battlefield, when they're lying there wounded, scream for their mom, not for dad, they scream for mom. Even before they scream for God, they scream for mom. So, is there something? What is that? Is there more to that?
Right. It could be. It's hard to tell if it's fully biological or if it's just something that globally that we've just become accustomed to. The woman is just going to become the primary caretaker, regardless of their job or regardless of their position in society. This is what's expected of them as they've given birth to their child.
Andrew, I'm sorry to stop you. Andrew, what do you feel about that? I mean, as a guy, wouldn't you want your child to scream for you too?
As a guy, well, I think the father-son dynamic is inherently complicated because of this cultural, these cultural norms we've developed about the man having to be absent to go to work and stuff. And I think that is part of the reason why we as human beings do tend to latch onto our moms more, because like you were saying, the mom is sort of seen as both the emotional and physical caretaker from a young age. But I think as, gender roles are questioned increasingly more, we might see that there might be new norms that emerge about how men relate to their son and whatnot. But yeah,
I'm asking you as a potential father. Would it not be heart-rendering to you to know that your daughter or son was lying there in the emergency room, and the last words that he or she spoke were, "Where's mommy?" and not "Where is daddy?" Doesn't give a shit about dad. Dad. Would you find that distressing?
I I could see why that would be frustrating to, not frustrating, but why that would be emotionally hard for a guy to deal with. In the sense that it would almost make you reflect and think, what did I do to make my son or daughter not want me in this role? Or why is the dynamic in this way that we can't have a more equitable sharing of love and compassion in this way? Yeah.
I have to say that I know that as a product of circumstances, you know, I was pretty close, very close indeed to my mother at the end of her life. My mother and father divorced, but my relationship with my father was extremely strained. And when, you know, one of the last conversations we had, he called me up and he said, Bonnie, you know, basically in anticipation of his imminent death, you know, are you proud of me? And, you know, I have to suppose that my father, and you guys are all going to face your parents' death someday unless you die first. I have to say, I have to assume that my father was, you know, asking that question sincerely, and that, you know, the strains that had developed in our relationship were devastating to him. And here he was at the end of his life, and this was his last opportunity to connect. And, you know, as I said, I'm sure it must surely be an issue for men. And I just wonder whether it is merely a cultural issue or whether it's something deeper. So we are now at 3:01, so let's go ahead and resume this next week. What I want to remind you of is that you have, you may, again, you may write an email to me, ask me any questions that you may have. Send it to the entire group. Once the first person writes a question, just go ahead and make a chain email, please, so that we will just keep on sending it around. If you can ask questions as to the hypothetical, you can ask questions as to the law. I will exercise some degree of discretion in which questions I answer, where it's something I think you probably ought to know. Also, Laura, do me the kindness of sending me, I will probably sit down and do this more or less immediately anyway, but remind me if by the end of the day I don't send a site for the Genocide Convention, okay? Because you guys will need the Genocide Convention in this, at least if you select one or another of the questions. One last point I wanted to make and didn't, and should have done in connection with minority rights, but should be obvious to you, that minority rights and when we're talking about a minority group within a state, raise some of the same issues as rights across state lines, and some of the issues that we talked about with regard to cultural relativity, right? And that is that, you know, Angela, the concern about releasing Angela raised issues globally, and not merely for persons within the United States, at least in the hypothetical, and for exactly the same reasons, because it puts at risk the cultures of other states. And so the charter will also be relevant to some of the questions that you'll be answering, okay?
Bonnie, I found the Genocide Convention while we were talking earlier. Shall I send the link in the...
Go right ahead, send it around, that would be great. That would be perfect. Okay, so anything else? We good? All right then, had fun with the test. I try to write a test that is fun to do. So I know it's a very demanding one, but I also hope that it really, you know, is fascinating issues. It raises fascinating issues to work with. All righty then, good luck. Have a lovely weekend and week. See you on Friday.